John Brown was driven to violent action against slavery primarily by his radical Calvinist Christian beliefs and the conviction that decades of peaceful abolitionist efforts had failed to end what he considered the nation's greatest sin. Brown was a deeply religious man who believed he was a personal instrument of God, called to use force to eradicate the inhuman institution of slavery. He felt this was a sacred obligation and compared his fight to the American Revolution, arguing it was just a fight for the God-given right of freedom. Brown grew increasingly dissatisfied with the slow pace and pacifism of the mainstream abolitionist movement. He believed that talk and political compromise were ineffective, stating, "These men are all talk. What we need is action, action." At age 12, Brown witnessed the brutal beating of an enslaved boy with an iron shovel. He later wrote that this experience led him to swear eternal war with slavery. Unlike many white abolitionists of his time, Brown treated black people as equals and lived among them for a period in a New York community. Frederick Douglass noted that Brown was as deeply interested in our cause as though his own soul had been pierced by the iron of slavery. Murder of Elijah Lovejoy. In 1837, the murder of anti-slavery newspaper publisher Elijah Lovejoy by a pro-slavery mob deeply affected Brown. At a memorial service, he publicly vowed to consecrate his life to slavery's destruction. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law, which required citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves, enraged Brown and prompted him to form the League of Gileadites, a militant group dedicated to protecting escaped enslaved people from capture. Bleeding Kansas. The violent conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in the Kansas Territory in the mid-1850s proved a turning point. The sacking of Lawrence by a pro-slavery posse and the caning of abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner on the Senate floor were the final catalysts for Brown to initiate the Potawatomi Massacre, where his group killed 5 pro-slavery settlers in retaliation. Ultimately, Brown was convinced that only bloodshed could purge the nation of the sin of slavery, a belief he articulated prophetically just before his execution. "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but a slave rebellion and eventually a free state for African Americans." The raid on Lawrence and the massacre at Potawatomi set off a brutal guerrilla war in Kansas. By the end of the year, over 200 people had been killed and property damage reached into the millions of dollars. Brown was viewed as a criminal, but saw himself as a freedom fighter. Over the next 3 years, Brown traveled throughout New England, collecting money from the same wealthy mercantile people who put him out of the woolen business several years earlier. Brown was now considered a criminal in Kansas and Missouri, and there was a reward for his capture. But in the eyes of Northern abolitionists, he was seen as a freedom fighter, doing God's will. By this time, he had devised a plan to travel to the South and arm slaves to incite a slave rebellion. Many, though not all, of his contributors knew the details of his plans. In early 1858, Brown sent his son, John Jr., to survey the country around Harper's Ferry, the site of the federal arsenal. Brown planned to build a force of between 1,500 and 4,000 men, but internal squabbles and delays caused many to defect. In July 1859, Brown rented a farm 5 miles north of Harper's Ferry, known as the Kennedy Farmhouse. He was joined by his daughter, daughter-in-law, and 3 of his sons. Northern abolitionist supporters sent 198 breech-loading, 52 caliber Sharps carbines, known as Breacher's Bibles. Over the summer, Brown and members of his family quietly lived in the farmhouse while he recruited volunteers for his raid. The Harper's Ferry Arsenal was a complex of buildings that housed over 100,000 muskets and rifles. At sundown on Sunday, October 16, 1859, Brown led a small band out from the farmhouse and crossed the Potomac River, then walked all night in the rain, reaching Harper's Ferry around 4 a.m. Leaving a rear guard of 3 men, Brown led the rest to the arsenal grounds. Initially, they met no resistance entering the town. They cut the telegraph wires and captured the railroad and wagon bridges entering the town. They also seized several buildings at the armory and rifle factory. Brown's men then went into nearby farms and kidnapped nearly 60 hostages, including the great-grandson of George Washington, Lewis Washington. However, none of the few slaves living on these farms joined them. Soon, word got out about the raid when armory workers discovered Brown's men on the morning of October 17th. Farmers, shopkeepers, and the militia from the area surrounded the armory. The raiders' only escape route, the bridge across the Potomac River, was cut off. Brown took his men and captives into the smaller engine house and barred the windows and doors as shots were exchanged between the raiders and the townspeople. After several hours, it was apparent the raid was failing. Brown sent out one of his sons, Watson, with a white flag to see if something could be negotiated. Watson was shot and killed on the spot. Several of Brown's men panicked and were wounded or killed while trying to escape. By the morning of October 18th, a detachment of U.S. Marines, led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, arrived to take back the arsenal. Negotiations failed, and Lee ordered a small contingent of the Marines to storm the engine house. In the first assault, led by Lieutenant Israel Green, attacked the engine house door with sledgehammers, but were driven back by a hail of bullets. In a second attack, the Marines wielded a large ladder and broke through the door with broadswords drawn. One of the Marines was shot, possibly by Brown, and died. The remaining raiders were quickly subdued, and all the hostages were saved. Brown was severely wounded by a broadsword to the back and abdomen. The assault was begun and over within minutes. Brown was tried and convicted of treason against Virginia, conspiracy with slaves, and first-degree murder. Sentenced to death, he was executed on December 2, 1859. 6 other raiders were executed over the next several months. In the short term, Brown's raid increased fears in Southern white people of slave rebellions and violence. Northern abolitionists initially characterized the raid as misguided and insane. But the trial transformed Brown into a martyr. On his way to the gallows, he handed a note to one of his jailers prophesizing on the fate of the United States. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. Slavery finally came to an end in the United States, but only after 4 years of war and the loss of over 600,000 lives.